James Stewart thought he'd found a refuge where Hollywood stars could finally tell the truth. Instead, Moral Re-Armament was collecting secrets from him and 11 other legends like inventory, weaponizing confessions to control careers, destroy marriages, and in one case, drive a young actress toward a tragedy covered up for 50 years. The Golden Cage opens 1938, Hollywood's golden year. Behind the studio gates, something darker than gossip was spreading through Bel Air mansions. Frank Buchman's Moral Re-Armament promised what the studio system couldn't, a place where stars could finally confess the truth. James Stewart sat across from Clark Gable, both admitting anxieties their screen personas would never reveal. Loretta Young spoke about the compromises fame demanded. For the first time since becoming famous, these legends could be human. But the movement demanded total transparency. Every fear, every sin, every secret shared in trust. And somewhere in those borrowed living rooms, something shifted. The confessions that felt like liberation were being cataloged. The refuge was becoming a prison, and James Stewart would be the first to realize it. James Stewart, the reluctant prophet. James Stewart joined Moral Re-Armament in 1939, drawn by a promise that resonated with everything his Presbyterian upbringing had taught him. Here was a way to reconcile the faith of his Pennsylvania childhood with the moral complications of Hollywood success. At 31 years old, already an Oscar nominee for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Stewart was discovering that playing moral paragons on screen made the compromises of real life feel heavier. Every publicity date arranged by MGM, every sanitized interview, every time he stayed silent while studio executives manipulated the truth, it all accumulated like moral debt. The house parties, as MRA called their gatherings, seemed to offer absolution. Stewart attended meetings in Beverly Hills homes where stars he admired shared their own struggles. They talked about the pressure to stay silent about studio corruption, about marriages arranged for publicity, about the loneliness of being public property. For the first time since becoming famous, Stewart could admit that success felt hollow, that he questioned whether any of his achievements were truly his own or just products of MGM's machinery. But by 1941, Stewart began noticing troubling patterns. The guidance sessions, where members would sit quietly and wait for divine direction, felt choreographed. He'd confess anxiety about an upcoming film, and days later, an MRA counselor would mention, casually, as if it had just occurred to them, that perhaps divine guidance suggested he accept the role. When he expressed uncertainty about a script that glorified war, he was told that his hesitation revealed moral weakness, a lack of faith in absolute values. The breaking point came when Stewart decided to enlist after Pearl Harbor. America had entered World War II, and Stewart, already a licensed pilot, felt called to serve. But MRA leaders framed his decision as an escape. They suggested, with careful language that never quite became an accusation, that he was running from the spiritual work required of him, that military service was easier than the absolute honesty MRA demanded, that a man truly committed to moral rearmament would recognize that changing Hollywood from within mattered more than fighting overseas. Stewart enlisted anyway. He spent 4 years flying bombing missions over Germany, rising to the rank of colonel, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Croix de Guerre. He came home in 1945 as a decorated war hero, but also as a man carrying trauma that would haunt him for decades. The nightmares, the guilt over missions that cost civilian lives, the way his hands shook when he tried to sleep. None of this fit MRA's framework of sin and redemption. And so Stewart found his exit in truth. He quietly stopped attending meetings. When former MRA friends pressed him, when counselors reached out suggesting he needed spiritual support to process the war, Stewart cited his battle with what we now call PTSD. It was real, devastatingly real, but it also gave him cover, a reason to withdraw that protected others still trapped inside the movement. To publicly denounce MRA would expose everyone he'd sat with, every secret shared in those rooms. Stewart's honor wouldn't allow that kind of betrayal. For the rest of his life, Stewart never spoke publicly about moral rearmament. But those who knew him well noticed something. He attended church regularly, read his Bible, lived by principles of honesty and service. He'd found his faith again, just not in the rooms where it had been weaponized. Even escaping, for James Stewart, required the quiet dignity that made audiences trust him in the first place. Stewart's silent withdrawal was one thread. Being pulled, MRA's tapestry was beginning to unravel, but they didn't know it yet. Loretta Young, the secret that became a weapon. What happened when MRA leaders discovered Loretta Young's most explosive secret and used it as leverage? If Stewart needed a war to escape, Young's exit would demand something more dangerous, protecting the truth about her own child. Young, already a major star by 1940, lived in terror of one revelation: that her adopted daughter Judy wasn't adopted at all, but her biological child with Clark Gable, conceived during the filming of The Call of the Wild. The 1930s offered no mercy for unwed mothers, especially not ones with Young's carefully cultivated Catholic saint image. So Young had hidden her pregnancy, disappeared for months claiming illness, then returned with an adopted daughter. Hollywood whispered, but the studio system held. Fixers protected the secret. Gable, already married, stayed silent, and Young built her career on, playing virtuous women while carrying the knowledge that exposure would destroy everything. She joined moral rearmament, seeking something she couldn't find in traditional confession: absolution without the ritual distance of a confessional booth. MRA's sharing sessions felt more intimate, more human. Here were other stars admitting to adultery, to ambition that trampled others, to the person they pretended to be versus who they really were. In this context, Young's secret felt less monstrous, just another compromise in an industry built on them. So in a private sharing session in 1942, with women she'd come to trust, Young told the truth. Judy was hers. Gable was the father. She'd been too frightened, too concerned for her career and her family's reputation, to do anything but hide the pregnancy and manufacture a socially acceptable story. The relief of confession felt like finally setting down a weight she'd carried alone. By 1943, Young was having doubts about moral rearmament. The movement's demands were escalating. More time at meetings, more money for Bookman's international travel, more pressure to recruit other stars. Young wanted to step back, to return to her Catholic faith with its clear structures and ancient rituals. But when she mentioned this to her MRA counselor, the conversation took a subtle turn. The counselor brought up Judy. Not threateningly, never that. Just mentioned her casually. "Such a beautiful child," she said. "And you've been so honest about her real story. We hold each other's truths in sacred trust here, don't we?" The words hung in the air, innocent on their surface, lethal underneath. Leave, and that sacred trust might become less sacred. Young understood perfectly. She'd given them ammunition, and now withdrawal had consequences. So she began a careful, years-long disengagement. She cited her Catholic faith, explaining that she needed traditional confession, not group sharing. She took roles that kept her on location, away from Los Angeles and MRA's meetings. She slowly, methodically, reduced her involvement until by 1947, she'd fully withdrawn. But the fear never left. Even decades later, Young lived with the terror that someone would reveal Judy's true parentage. When Judy finally learned the truth in her 30s and published a memoir after Young's death, the revelation that Young had dreaded her entire life finally came. The irony was bitter. She'd stayed silent to protect herself. But silence had also damaged her daughter. MRA had taught Young that confession could be weaponized, and that lesson had shaped every relationship that followed. Young's fear was justified. Another thread pulled loose, but MRA still didn't understand what was building against them. And Sheridan, the staged redemption. Anne Sheridan discovered that MRA didn't just hold secrets. They orchestrated public confessions as spiritual theater. Hollywood's oomph girl became Warner Brothers' biggest sex symbol in the late 1930s. But by 1941, the studio worried her image had become too racy. They needed her to seem more wholesome, more marriageable to middle American audiences. The solution came from an unlikely source: moral rearmament. If Sheridan underwent a public spiritual transformation, Warner Brothers executives reasoned, it would add depth to her image while maintaining her appeal. Sheridan attended her first MRA meeting reluctantly, expecting quiet, spiritual reflection. She'd grown up Catholic in Texas and imagined something resembling a church service. Instead, she found herself in a carefully orchestrated performance. MRA leaders had already planned her redemption arc. They wanted her to deliver a public testimony at the Hollywood Bowl, confessing to vanity, selfishness, and the moral compromises of playing seductive roles. They'd written the speech for her, complete with dramatic pauses and carefully chosen sins to admit. When Sheridan saw the script, she refused. These weren't her words. Half the sins described weren't even things she'd done. The speech painted her as a shallow woman redeemed by MRA's guidance. But the real Anne Sheridan was intelligent, well-read, politically engaged. She'd come to the meetings hoping for genuine spiritual growth, not another publicity stunt. MRA leaders responded with pressure wrapped in spiritual language. They suggested that her resistance revealed pride, that true humility meant accepting their guidance about how to share her transformation. When that didn't work, they took a different approach. A counselor mentioned to Sheridan that Warner Brothers had been very supportive of MRA's work in Hollywood. Jack Warner himself appreciated how the movement was helping contract players develop moral character. That the studio might find a more cooperative leading lady if Sheridan proved difficult. The message was clear. Perform the redemption or find yourself replaced. Sheridan understood power dynamics better than the MRA counselors realized. She'd spent years navigating studio politics, dealing with executives who thought beautiful women were interchangeable. So she delivered the speech at the Hollywood Bowl in 1942, hitting every mark, pausing for applause, confessing to sins she'd never committed. But the moment the speech ended, Sheridan walked away from moral rearmament and never returned. She told friends exactly what she thought. I thought I was joining a church. Turns out I was signing up for a different kind of studio system. MRA leaders quietly dropped her from promotional materials, recognizing that a half-hearted convert was worse than no convert at all. Warner Brothers never formally punished Sheridan for refusing to be MRA's poster girl. But her contract renewal negotiations that year went cold. Roles she'd been promised went to more cooperative actresses. The message was subtle but clear. Defying MRA meant defying the studio executives who supported them. It took Sheridan 3 years to fully recover her career momentum. A small price compared to what others paid, but a price nonetheless. Yet, Sheridan's escape was cleaner than most because she'd never truly believed. She'd seen the manipulation from the start and played along only as long as necessary. But her quick exit served as a warning to others, a proof that MRA's power could be resisted. Young actresses watched how Sheridan walked away, and some found courage in her example. Years later, when asked about her brief involvement with MRA, Sheridan would laugh. "Honey, I've been performing my whole life. The only difference was they wanted me to perform piety instead of desire. I'm good at both. But at least Warner Brothers paid me for the show." Another star who'd been watching was beginning to question whether the spiritual salvation MRA promised was worth the psychological price they demanded. Jane Wyman. The confession. Trapped Jane Wyman joined Moral Re-Armament in 1946 during her troubled marriage to Ronald Reagan, hoping the movement could heal what was fracturing between them. MRA promised that absolute honesty from both partners, complete confession of failings and resentments, would create the foundation for genuine intimacy. Both Wyman and Reagan attended meetings. Both participated in sharing sessions, both committed to the 4 absolutes. But Wyman quickly discovered a troubling pattern. No matter how completely she confessed, her career ambition, her guilt about balancing motherhood and work, her frustrations with Reagan's growing political interests, the counselors always found deeper sins requiring further exploration. She'd admit to impatience, and they'd suggest that revealed selfishness. She'd confess to selfishness, and they'd find pride underneath. Every confession opened doors to demand more confession, creating a spiral where redemption remained always just out of reach. Reagan, meanwhile, flourished in MRA's environment. The movement's focus on moral absolutes, on clear distinctions between right and wrong, aligned perfectly with his developing political philosophy. He found in MRA's framework a language for the conservative values he was beginning to articulate. While Wyman spiraled through endless cycles of confession and guilt, Reagan was being shaped into the ideological figure he'd become. The breaking point arrived in 1948 as their marriage collapsed. Wyman wanted a divorce, recognizing that she and Reagan had become fundamentally incompatible. But MRA counselors framed this as moral failure. Specifically, her moral failure. They suggested she confess publicly to being a difficult wife, to putting career above marriage, to failing in the absolute unselfishness the movement demanded. The confession would be her path to redemption, they promised, even if the marriage ended. Wyman refused. She'd spent 2 years confessing, repenting, searching for the deeper sins MRA kept insisting she harbored. She'd performed remorse until she couldn't remember which feelings were genuine and which were scripts written by counselors. Enough, she told friends, with the sharp clarity that comes from finally seeing manipulation for what it is. I'm done performing repentance. She divorced Reagan and left Moral Re-Armament simultaneously, walking away from both the marriage and the movement that had tried to save it. Years later, Wyman would speak about how MRA had used gendered expectations. Women must be selfless, pure, endlessly forgiving, as tools of control. Her escape became a quiet feminist act before feminism had language for what she'd experienced. The contradictions were piling up. Stars were beginning to ask the same questions and notice the same patterns, but MRA's true darkness hadn't yet been fully revealed. If these revelations have opened your eyes to Hollywood's hidden history, please subscribe to Golden Age Files. We're uncovering the stories the studios buried and the truth behind the legends you love. And we're just getting started with MRA's grip on Hollywood. 5 stars down, 7 to go. But if you're noticing a pattern, stars discovering manipulation, then quietly escaping, you're missing what's building beneath the surface. Because MRA wasn't just controlling individuals. They were creating a culture where Hollywood's biggest names policed each other, reported on each other, and used each other's confessed secrets as leverage. The next star's story reveals just how deep that control went, and how it poisoned even genuine moments of grief. Glenn Ford, the manufactured testimony. Glenn Ford experienced genuine spiritual searching after his father's death in 1945. The loss left him questioning everything: his career choices, his relationships, the meaning of success in an industry built on illusion. When friends suggested moral rearmament might offer community and meaning, Ford attended meetings hoping to find connection with others navigating similar questions. The sharing sessions helped. Ford talked about his grief, about feeling unmoored, about wondering if acting mattered when set against the weight of mortality. Other members listened, shared their own losses, created the kind of vulnerable community that Hollywood's competitive culture rarely allowed. For months, Ford found genuine comfort in these gatherings. Then in 1947, MRA's magazine arrived at Ford's home. He opened it to find his own face staring back at him above an article titled "Finding Faith in Hollywood." He began reading, expecting perhaps a brief mention of his involvement. Instead, he found a lengthy testimony detailing his spiritual transformation, his journey from grief to redemption, using language about divine guidance and moral awakening that he'd never spoken. The piece quoted him extensively, painting his father's death as the catalyst for embracing MRA's 4 absolutes and dedicating himself to Bookman's mission. Ford was stunned. He'd never written this article. He'd never even been interviewed for it. MRA had taken his private sharings from meetings, intimate confessions shared in what he'd believed was sacred confidence, and transformed them into propaganda. They'd embellished his words, added theological language he'd never used, and published it all under his name, without permission or even notification. When Ford confronted MRA leaders, their response revealed everything about how the movement operated. They hadn't deceived him, they explained. They'd simply helped him express what he truly meant. His raw grief needed shaping, refining into testimony that could inspire others. They'd done him a service by translating his pain into purpose. Ford demanded a retraction. MRA refused. The article had already brought dozens of new members to the movement, they said. People had been moved by his story and had found their own faith strengthened by his example. Surely he wouldn't want to undermine that spiritual work over concerns about authorial control. Wasn't that pride speaking? The kind of ego attachment MRA existed to transcend. Ford walked away immediately, instructing his agent to threaten legal action if MRA ever used his name again. The experience left him deeply suspicious of organized religion for the rest of his life. He'd offered his genuine grief, his real questions, his authentic struggle, and watched it get commodified into marketing material. The betrayal wasn't just about words on a page. It was about discovering that even sincere faith could be exploited by people who saw spiritual awakening as a product to sell. But the betrayal left scars beyond his suspicion of organized religion. Ford, who'd been considering writing his autobiography, never did. Friends who encouraged him to put his life story on paper were met with the same response. "I've learned what happens when you trust people with your truth. They turn it into something you don't recognize." MRA hadn't just stolen his words. They'd stolen his willingness to share his authentic self with the world. Years later, Ford would say the MRA experience taught him the most important lesson of his career. Everyone in Hollywood wants to tell your story. Studios want to manufacture it, publicists want to polish it, and apparently, religious movements want to sanctify it. The only way to keep your story yours is to never tell it completely to anyone who sees you as material rather than human. But if Ford escaped with his integrity intact, another star's discovery would shake her faith in everything MRA claimed to represent. What she learned about Bookman would force her to choose between exposure and complicity. Anne Harding, the founder's secret Anne Harding, known for playing sophisticated, morally complex women on screen, brought that same intelligence to her spiritual life. She joined Moral Re-Armament in 1937, attracted by Frank Bookman's charisma and his intellectual approach to faith. Unlike more emotional revival movements, MRA promised rational spiritual development, systematic moral improvement. Harding became one of Bookman's trusted confidants, accompanying him on international tours to spread the movement's message. During a 1940 European tour, Harding witnessed something that shattered her faith in both Bookman and the movement he'd created. At a gathering in Germany, she heard Bookman praise Hitler's moral discipline, suggesting that Nazi Germany's strength came from spiritual purity and moral clarity. When Harding objected privately, she had Jewish friends in Hollywood. She understood what the Nazi regime truly represented. Buchman explained himself with chilling pragmatism. He was playing both sides, he told her. MRA needed to maintain international influence, and that required making accommodations with whoever held power. The four absolutes weren't really absolute, he suggested, when political reality demanded flexibility. Yes, the Nazi regime was troubling, but by maintaining access to German leaders, MRA could potentially influence them toward moderation. Strategic compromise served the greater good. Harding recognized this logic for what it was. The same moral relativism MRA claimed to oppose, dressed up in strategic language. The movement that demanded absolute honesty from its members practiced calculated deception at its highest levels. The founder, who required absolute purity from followers, praised a regime built on racial ideology. The man who preached absolute unselfishness traveled in luxury while members donated to fund his lifestyle. But what could Harding do with this knowledge? Exposing Buchman meant revealing her own complicity. She'd remained silent for months after witnessing his Nazi sympathies, continued traveling with him, and participated in meetings where his moral authority went unchallenged. Speaking up now would raise questions about why she'd waited, what she'd been willing to overlook. So Harding chose a different path. She quietly withdrew from MRA in 1940, offering no public explanation. But she used her platform and resources to support Jewish refugees fleeing Europe, to advocate for American intervention against fascism, to fund organizations actively opposing Nazi Germany. Her activism became a silent rebuke to Buchman's calculations, a living testimony that true moral courage sometimes meant acting rather than confessing. Harding never publicly revealed what she'd learned about Buchman. She carried that knowledge as both burden and lesson, that charismatic leaders who demand absolute virtue from followers rarely hold themselves to the same standards. Those movements built on moral purity often compromise most quickly when power is at stake. That sometimes the most important revelations are the ones you use to guide your own actions rather than expose others. MRA's moral foundation was cracking. Stars were discovering that the four absolutes were negotiable at the top. But the movement's cruelty toward vulnerability would claim its most devastating victim next. Robert Walker, the family betrayal. Robert Walker, already struggling with mental health challenges and his painful divorce from Jennifer Jones, was brought into moral rearmament by his father in 1945. Walker's father believed the movement would provide the discipline and moral structure his son desperately needed. He'd watched Walker's anxiety spiral into depression, seen his son's career suffer as personal struggles became public, and convinced himself that spiritual guidance could succeed where everything else had failed. But MRA's approach to mental illness was dangerously simplistic. They interpreted Walker's anxiety and depression as moral failings, evidence of insufficient honesty with himself, inadequate commitment to the four absolutes. When Walker confessed to counselors about contemplating self-harm, about the days when getting out of bed felt impossible, about the panic attacks that left him unable to work, they suggested these symptoms revealed a spiritual crisis rather than psychiatric illness. MRA discouraged psychiatric treatment. They framed therapy and medication as worldly solutions that treated symptoms while ignoring root causes. The real cure, they insisted, lay in more intensive spiritual work, longer sharing sessions, deeper confession, absolute surrender to divine guidance. Walker's father supported this approach, believing that his son's problems stemmed from moral weakness rather than chemical imbalance. For several years, Walker tried to meet MRA's expectations. He attended meetings, participated in sharing, searched desperately for the spiritual breakthrough that would heal his mind. But his condition only worsened. The constant pressure to confess, the framing of mental illness as moral failure, the guilt over disappointing his father. All of it compounded his existing struggles. Walker's escape came through the intervention of a psychiatrist who recognized that his patient's participation in MRA was actively harmful. The doctor helped Walker understand that depression wasn't sin requiring repentance, but illness requiring treatment. Armed with this framework, Walker found the courage to leave the movement in 1950, but the guilt over disappointing his father never fully left. Walker's father remained devoted to MRA, convinced that his son had chosen worldly medicine over spiritual healing. The rupture between them, father certain he was trying to save his son's soul, son trying to save his own life, never fully healed. Walker died in 1951, shortly after telling his psychiatrist that leaving MRA had been necessary for survival, but that the cost in family relationships had been devastating. Walker's tragedy reveals MRA's cruelest dimension, their rejection of modern medicine in favor of spiritual solutions. By framing mental illness as moral failure, they not only failed to help struggling members, but actively prevented them from seeking effective treatment. Walker's story stands as testament to the real human cost when spiritual movements prioritize doctrine over the well-being of people they claim to serve. Walker's tragedy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Not everyone survived their encounter with moral rearmament. Some paid with their mental health, others with years of their lives. But understanding how MRA caused such damage requires understanding their financial structure, because spiritual movements that demand absolute honesty from followers rarely practice it themselves. Irene Dunn, The Price of Questioning. Irene Dunn was about to discover exactly how dishonest the four absolutes really were. Irene Dunn, known as much for her intelligence and business acumen as for her performances, joined Moral Re-Armament in 1938. A devout Catholic and established philanthropist, Dunn was impressed by MRA's apparent charitable work and international reach. She donated generously to fund the movement's conferences and traveling missions, and recruited other stars by sharing how MRA had deepened her faith. But by 1942, Dunn's philanthropic experience raised questions. She sat in Frank Bookman's borrowed Beverly Hills estate one afternoon, holding a ledger that didn't add up. She donated $50,000 over 4 years, roughly $1.2 million in today's money. The annual reports claimed these funds supported missionary work in Asia, orphanages in Europe, peace conferences in Switzerland. But Dunn, who'd served on the board of 3 legitimate charities, recognized something. The expense categories were deliberately vague. Conference operations, international coordination, spiritual infrastructure. She'd seen studio accounting that was more transparent than this. When she asked the counselor reviewing finances with her where the money actually went, the woman smiled. "Sister Irene, these questions suggest you value worldly accountability over spiritual trust," Dunn persisted. Her professional experience in navigating studio contracts, teaching her to recognize evasion. MRA's financial opacity triggered every warning instinct. When she requested detailed documentation, which charities received MRA's funds, what percentage went to actual charitable work versus administration, how much money supported Bookman's extensive international travel, she received only more vague responses about spiritual work that defied conventional accounting. Her questions were reframed as lack of faith, as evidence that she valued worldly transparency over spiritual trust. Through careful investigation, Dunn eventually discovered that most donations funded Bookman's luxurious lifestyle and elaborate conference centers that functioned more like resorts for the movement's leadership than venues for charitable work. The international missions she'd believed were spreading spiritual renewal were often simply expensive travel for Bookman and his inner circle. But the deepest betrayal wasn't financial. It was personal. The counselor who'd sat with Dunn during her lowest moment, when her mother died in 1941, who'd held her hand and prayed with her, who'd become like family. That same woman was the one who'd encouraged Dunn's largest donations while knowing exactly where the money really went. The friendship had been a strategy all along. When Dunn announced she was leaving MRA in 1943, the punishment was immediate and absolute. MRA members who'd been close friends for years stopped speaking to her. She was excluded from social gatherings, removed from Hollywood benefit committees where MRA members held influence, subtly blacklisted from the very philanthropic circles she'd helped build. The social exile was MRA's way of sending a message. Questioning the movement's finances meant questioning its spiritual authority, and that kind of disloyalty carried consequences. Dunn never spoke publicly about MRA's financial practices. A lawsuit would have been costly and potentially exposed other stars who remained in the movement. But she warned young actresses privately, offering advice that reflected her painful education. "Some churches want your soul. That one wanted my checkbook." Her experience revealed MRA as essentially a spiritual pyramid scheme, where donations from believers funded the comfortable lives of leaders, while genuine charitable work remained minimal. Late in life, Dunn was asked if she regretted joining MRA, if those 4 years felt wasted. Her response revealed the wisdom earned through betrayal. "I don't regret seeking spiritual community. I regret assuming that people who speak the language of faith are incapable of the same greed that drives Hollywood. That was naive. But naivety isn't a sin. Exploiting it is. I learned to tell the difference, and that education was worth the price I paid." If questioning finances brought exile, another star would discover that simply succeeding outside MRA brought something worse: calculated sabotage disguised as patriotic duty. Which of these revelations surprised you most? Did you have family members who remember when MRA had its grip on Hollywood? And what other hidden chapters of Golden Age history should we explore next? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your suggestions guide our research. Melvyn Douglas, The Blacklist Threat. Melvyn Douglas, married to actress and politician Helen Gahagan Douglas, joined MRA briefly in 1940, but left within months. His departure stemmed from moral objections. MRA's political neutrality during the rise of fascism seemed less like principled nonpartisanship and more like moral cowardice. Douglas believed that absolute morality demanded taking stands against evil, not maintaining diplomatic relationships with totalitarian regimes for the sake of international influence, but leaving MRA in Hollywood's golden age meant entering their informal blacklist. In 1947, as the House Un-American Activities Committee began investigating communist influence in Hollywood, Douglas discovered that MRA was providing names to investigators, not names of communists. MRA had no particular evidence of political subversion. Rather, they offered names of former members who'd criticized the movement, suggesting that spiritual instability might correlate with political unreliability. The logic was insidious. MRA framed their cooperation with HUAC as a patriotic duty. Those who'd left the movement had demonstrated moral weakness, they argued, the kind of character flaws that might make them susceptible to communist ideology. It was speculation dressed up as spiritual insight, using the language of moral concern to punish former members who dared to question or leave. Douglas was never formally blacklisted by HUAC. His name never appeared on official lists. No congressional testimony explicitly named him. But between 1948 and 1952, his roles mysteriously dried up. Scripts that seemed perfect for his talents went to other actors. Studios that had eagerly hired him suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Producers expressed vague concerns about his reliability. Years later, Douglas learned that MRA representatives had contacted studios with subtle warnings. Nothing actionable, nothing that could constitute defamation. Just quiet suggestions that Douglas's spiritual instability, evidenced by his departure from MRA, made him a potential risk. In an industry already paranoid about political associations, the innuendo was enough. Only Helen Gahagan, Douglas's prominent political career, she served in Congress from 1945 to 1951, provided some protection. Attacking Melvyn too overtly might draw attention to MRA's activities, potentially exposing their collaboration with HUAC and their systematic punishment of former members. So the sabotage remained subtle, deniable, just effective enough to damage his career without leaving evidence of malice. Douglas returned to steady work in the mid-1950s as MRA's Hollywood influence waned and the Red Scare began to lose its grip on the industry. But the experience taught him how spiritual movements could weaponize political paranoia. MRA had found the perfect moment to punish defectors, an era when mere suspicion could destroy careers, when accusations didn't require proof, when defending yourself looked like evidence of guilt. Douglas survived MRA's revenge, but the experience changed how he understood power. In a 1962 interview, he said something that applied far beyond his own story. The question isn't whether institutions abuse power. They all do eventually. The question is whether you can recognize abuse early enough to leave before you're destroyed, and whether you have the resources to survive leaving. Most people don't have those resources. I did. Barely. That's not virtue, that's luck. The virtue is in using your survival to warn others. MRA's power depended on secrecy. Once their methods became visible, their influence began evaporating. But one star would discover something even more devastating than financial exploitation or career sabotage. Evidence connecting MRA to a member's death. Colleen Moore, the suicide cover-up. Colleen Moore, who'd successfully transitioned from silent films to sound pictures, joined Moral Re-Armament in 1939. The movement appealed to her intellectual curiosity and her genuine desire for spiritual community. She befriended a younger actress, whose name Moore's biographers have consistently withheld, respecting the family's privacy, who became deeply involved in MRA's confession culture. This younger actress struggled with the cycle MRA created. Confess your sins, receive temporary absolution, then be told that new sins required confession. The pressure to share more, reveal deeper secrets, demonstrate absolute honesty became overwhelming. In early 1944, Moore received a letter from her friend describing crushing guilt over a confession MRA counselors had pressured her to make public. The letter expressed desperation, suggesting that ending her life might be preferable to facing the exposure MRA demanded. Days later, the young woman was found dead from what officials ruled an accidental overdose. But Moore had that letter. Evidence suggesting the death wasn't accidental, that MRA's psychological pressure had pushed a vulnerable person past her breaking point. Moore brought the letter to MRA leaders, asking whether they bore responsibility for demanding a public confession that had driven her friend to such desperation. The response was chilling. The letter didn't exist. Moore was grieving, misremembering, perhaps even manufacturing evidence to blame the movement for a tragic accident. If Moore mentioned the letter to authorities or reporters, MRA would be forced to question her own stability, suggesting that her grief had created false memories. The threat was clear. Speak up, An MRA would destroy her credibility. Moore made a devastating calculation. Revealing the letter would hurt the deceased woman's family more than it would damage MRA. The movement would simply deny everything, question Moore's mental state, and drag the young woman's struggles through public scrutiny. The family would gain nothing from exposure, except more pain. So Moore kept a copy of the letter, but remained publicly silent. She left MRA immediately, unable to remain in a movement she now saw as bearing responsibility for someone's death. But the decision haunted her for decades. Had her silence protected the family? Or had it enabled MRA to continue pressuring other vulnerable members? Should she have fought harder, regardless of the cost to the deceased woman's reputation? Before her own death, Moore left the letter to a biographer with specific instructions. Publish it only if MRA still existed as an active movement. If the organization had dissolved, let the deceased rest in peace. But if MRA continued recruiting members, continued using confession as psychological control, then the truth needed to be told. Moore's delayed act of conscience recognized that sometimes protecting individuals means allowing institutions to escape accountability, and that this compromise carries its own moral weight. 11 stars, 11 different escapes. Some quiet, some tragic, some costly, some lucky. But all of them were individual acts, private rebellions against a movement that thrived on privacy. As long as each escape remained silent, as long as no one spoke publicly about what happened behind MRA's holy facade, the movement could survive. They could lose members without losing power, because the illusion remained intact. Till one star decided that silence was complicity, that protecting the movement meant betraying everyone still trapped inside. Moore's silence protected the innocent. But our final star's escape would require the opposite, speaking up publicly and loudly. And in doing so, she would do what 11 others couldn't. She would break moral rearmament's grip on Hollywood forever. Rosalind Russell, the public exit. Rosalind Russell, Hollywood's quick-witted queen of screwball comedy, joined moral rearmament in 1941. The movement's appeal to intelligent, successful women made sense. Here was a spiritual framework that claimed to value women's leadership, that suggested moral authority came from character rather than male ecclesiastical hierarchies. Russell participated actively for 5 years, during which time she witnessed the full scope of MRA's operations. By 1946, Russell had seen too much. She'd watched the financial exploitation Irene Dunn had discovered. She'd observed the psychological manipulation that drove Jane Wyman into guilt spirals. She'd noticed how MRA silenced critics through social punishment. Most importantly, she'd recognized that the movement's promise of spiritual renewal was really a sophisticated system of control dressed up in religious language. Unlike others who quietly withdrew, Russell decided in 1948 to make a public statement. She gave an interview to Luella Parsons, Hollywood's most powerful gossip columnist, carefully choosing her words for maximum impact while minimizing legal risk. MRA talks about absolute honesty, but practices selective truth, Russell said. I found it more interested in controlling stars than saving souls. The interview created headlines. Russell's reputation for intelligence and wit made the criticism credible rather than vengeful. She wasn't a disgruntled member making wild accusations. She was Hollywood royalty, calmly explaining why a supposedly spiritual movement operated more like a business exploiting its clients. Studios panicked. Would Russell become controversial? Would audiences reject her for attacking a religious organization? Would MRA retaliate by exposing secrets she'd shared in confession sessions? The questions reflected Hollywood's constant anxiety about stars stepping out of line, saying things that might complicate their marketability. But Russell's gamble paid off because she'd correctly calculated the cultural moment. By 1948, MRA's influence was already waning. The movement had overreached, tried to control too many high-profile stars, created too many enemies among people who had both platforms and grudges. Russell's public criticism gave other dissatisfied members permission to leave. Some stars privately thanked her, acknowledging they'd been too frightened to speak first. Others quietly stopped attending meetings, using Russell's statement as cover for their own exits. MRA never recovered its Hollywood influence. By the early 1950s, the movement had largely withdrawn from the film industry, seeking new converts in business and political circles where their methods might work on less public figures. Russell proved that sometimes the truth could set you free, if you were brave enough to speak it and powerful enough to survive the consequences. What made these 12 stars different? Not intelligence or inherent morality. Many brilliant, good people remained trapped in MRA for years or even decades. The difference was often circumstantial. Military service that provided Stewart an honorable exit. Personal tragedy that forced Walker to choose treatment over theology. Financial literacy that made Dunn recognize exploitation. or simply the right moment when choosing yourself over belonging became possible. Some escaped because they possessed resources others lacked. Stewart's war record gave him protection. Russell's established career and sharp wit made her criticism credible rather than merely bitter. Douglas's wife's political prominence shielded him from complete professional destruction. But others, like Walker, paid devastating prices for their exits. The young woman Moore knew paid the ultimate price. The patterns MRA used, weaponizing confession, creating shame spirals, using social exile as punishment, rejecting medical treatment in favor of spiritual solutions, appear in every era's controlling movements, whether it's spiritual organizations, political groups, or even toxic workplaces and relationships. The mechanisms remain consistent. The stars who escaped MRA teach us to recognize these patterns before they become prisons. Demands for total transparency without reciprocity, escalating requirements that keep redemption always out of reach, punishment for questioning, isolation from outside support. MRA faded from Hollywood by the mid-1950s, but its methods persist. Understanding how it operated, how it trapped even sophisticated stars who should have recognized manipulation, helps us identify similar dynamics in contemporary contexts. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings encoded in the stories of people who learned too late what they were joining. None of these 12 stars were perfect. They made mistakes before, during, and after MRA. Some remained silent when they could have spoken. Some spoke up only when their own interests were threatened. Some escaped early while others they'd recruited remained trapped. But they shared one crucial quality. When they recognized deception, even deception they'd participated in, they chose truth over comfort. That's the real Hollywood ending. Not perfect heroes, but flawed people choosing to be better. If this hidden chapter of Hollywood history moved you, please like this video and share it with fellow lovers of Golden Age cinema. These stories matter because they remind us that even the most glamorous eras had darkness. And that courage means choosing truth over image. Subscribe to Golden Age Files, where we honor our legends by telling their whole stories, shadows and all. Until next time, this is Golden Age Files, celebrating the complicated, courageous humanity behind the silver screen.